My military service doesn't matter here, Colonel. That's what Carolyn Peterson, the self-appointed queen of our neighborhood HOA, told my wife when she came home after nearly a year deployed on the USS Harry S. Truman. Instead of a warm homecoming, my wife, Colonel Evelyn Reed, was hit with a $75 fine, all because our handmade welcome sign was 4 inches too tall. That was Carolyn's first mistake. She thought her clipboard gave her unchecked power in our quiet suburb. What she didn't realize was that she'd just picked a fight with a woman who commanded 300 sailors and outranked every police officer in our county. And what happened next? Let's just say it escalated. The morning Eve came home felt like Christmas, and our wedding day rolled into one. I'd barely slept the night before, running through last-minute preparations. The house was spotless, fresh flowers were arranged on the table, and I had just finished crafting a custom wooden sign reading, "Welcome Home, Colonel Red," a bold red, white, and blue letters painted proudly across the grain. As I stepped outside to hang it, the neighborhood looked like a page from a patriotic magazine. Lawns were flawless, gardens pristine, and American flags danced in the breeze. It felt like the kind of place where military service would be honored and respected. Or so I believed. I double-checked my phone and security cameras, just a hunch, but something told me it might be wise to have everything documented. Neighbors were aware of Eve's return too. Mrs. Patterson across the street had said she'd be watching for the Navy car. Even Mr. Langston, the older gentleman who walked his dog every morning, had asked when our hero would be back. I positioned the welcome sign perfectly at the first thing she'd see when turning onto our street. Everything felt ready. Then the Navy sedan pulled up, and there she was. My wife stepped out in full dress uniform, polished shoes, decorated chest, colonel's insignia gleaming in the sunlight. She stood tall and calm, carrying the kind of presence only 15 years of service can build. As soon as she saw me, she dropped her duffel and ran into my arms. Tears welled up in both our eyes. "I missed home," she whispered into my chest. "I missed you." It was exactly the reunion I had imagined. Neighbors emerged onto their porches, clapping, waving, cheering. I even noticed our next-door neighbor Sarah watching from behind her curtain, looking torn between admiration and something less clear. She quickly ducked out of sight. At the time, I thought she was just giving us privacy. I was wrong. Eve looked around with a smile, soaking in the safety and calm she had fought so hard to defend. "This is what I imagined on those long nights at sea," she said softly. "Peace, family, freedom." That's when Carolyn Peterson made her entrance, a clipboard in hand, tape measure dangling from her belt, and her HO badge pinned like a Medal of Honor. She crossed the street like she owned it. Caroline was in her early 60s, her steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes scanned everything with the cold precision of a customs officer looking for contraband. "I hate to interrupt," she said, with a voice that clearly didn't hate it at all, "but we have a violation that requires immediate attention." Without waiting for a response, she marched over to the welcome sign and began measuring. She mumbled numbers under her breath, scribbled something down, then turned to us with the satisfaction of a mall cop catching a teenager loitering. 4.2 inches over the limit, she declared. Section 12.3a of our HO guidelines. She then gave Eve a once-over, her gaze lingering on the uniform with something between contempt and mockery. "This isn't a military installation," she said coolly. "Colonel." "Yes, she said it with air quotes. "In this neighborhood, we follow HO rules. Your previous job doesn't give you special privileges." It was condescending, petty, disrespectful. I felt my jaw tighten, fists clenching involuntarily, but Eve remained calm. Her expression didn't change, though I could tell she was registering every detail. With grace and composure, she stepped forward and replied like the leader she is. "Of course, Mrs. Peterson." Eve responded with steady calm. "We'll make the necessary changes to ensure the sign meets the neighborhood guidelines." Her tone was respectful, professional, but I could read between the lines Eve was already evaluating Caroline the way she would assess a volatile situation overseas. Every glance, every movement, every word was being mentally filed away. To her, this wasn't just an unpleasant interaction, it was a potential threat. Carolyn, on the other hand, looked almost disappointed by Eve's calm demeanor, as though she had been hoping for a confrontation she could escalate. You have exactly 48 hours to correct the violation, she announced with robotic authority. Welcome to civilian life, Colonel Reed. She emphasized the word civilian like it was an insult, a pointed reminder that in her world, military rank meant nothing. The subtext was clear: your medals don't matter here, my rules do. As she turned and walked away, clipboard tucked under her arm like a holstered weapon, I instinctively began recording with my phone. Something about her attitude set off every internal alarm. I had a gut feeling that this wouldn't be the last time we'd need proof of her behavior. From across the street, Sarah's curtains shifted again. I caught a glimpse of her anxious expression before she quickly retreated from view. There was a strange tension hanging in the air. The entire neighborhood felt like it was watching, silently bracing for whatever would come next. Eve stood quietly, her eyes fixed on Carolyn's retreating figure with the same sharp attention she'd used when tracking enemy movements during missions. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just an annoying HOA complaint. This was the start of something bigger and far more personal. Later that evening, we sat quietly in our living room, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the medals, awards, and commendations that marked Eve's decorated service. But her face held a different expression than I'd ever seen. She stared at her military decorations, her jaw set, her eyes distant. What if she's right? She murmured. Her voice was barely audible. What if I don't belong here anymore? The words cut deep. Everything we had built, every sacrifice, every dream now felt like it was hanging in the balance, challenged not by enemies overseas, but by a woman with a badge and a clipboard. What would you do? Stay silent, a broken bar, or push back? 3 days passed before Carolyn returned, at this time at precisely 7:00 a.m., flanked by what looked like an official inspector and armed with construction-grade measuring equipment. She didn't bother with greetings. "We're conducting a full property inspection," she announced flatly. The man beside her looked uncomfortable, shuffling behind her like he wanted to be anywhere else. But he said nothing. "Your mailbox," Caroline continued, "is extending 2.1 inches into the sidewalk easement. That's a clear violation of both municipal and HOA codes." She handed me another violation notice, this one for $75. The language on the document made it sound like we'd committed a felony, not just installed a mailbox an inch too far from the curb. When I pointed out the absurdity of the complaint, Carolyn's tone shifted into something syrupy and smug. "This is about upholding standards, Mr. Reed. Surely your wife understands the value of discipline and order, even here in civilian life." That's when Eve stepped outside, wearing workout clothes and still catching her breath from her morning run. But even in casual attire, she moved with the poise and presence of a commanding officer. Her posture alone demanded attention, except, apparently, from Carolyn, who seemed oddly energized by Eve's appearance, like this was the battle she'd been waiting for. "Colonel Reed," she said in exaggerated formality, "I'm sure you'll handle this issue with the same diligence you demonstrated in the Navy." The jab was subtle, but its intent wasn't lost on either of us. Caroline was implying that Eve's years of service hadn't prepared her for the real challenge, navigating suburban bureaucracy. Eve's expression barely changed, but I noticed her jaw tighten slightly, her only visible reaction to the insult. Just a few days later, Carolyn struck again, and with almost military precision. She appeared as if from thin air, moments after Eve had returned from a grocery run. Our SUV was still in the driveway, bags of supplies barely unloaded. Without a word, Carolyn approached, tape measure in hand. "The rear of your vehicle is extending 3 inches past the end of your driveway," she announced triumphantly, as if she'd just busted an illegal smuggling ring. This time, the fine was $150, and the violation notice came complete with black and white photos taken from multiple angles, as if this minor infraction was part of a federal investigation. When Eve challenged the absurdity of the claim, Carolyn's response laid bare her real agenda. "Mrs. Reed," she said with mock sympathy, "I've been incredibly patient during your adjustment to civilian life, but patience only goes so far. In this neighborhood, we follow the rules." Across the street, I caught movement behind Sarah's curtains again. She was watching just like before, and something in her eyes told me she knew more than she was letting on. A broken bar, the rules that govern our community. From our front window, I could see Sarah watching, her face etched with distress. hands wringing as if physically restraining herself from stepping in. But she didn't. She never did. It wasn't cowardice. It was something deeper, a experience. Her retreat spoke volumes. She'd seen this before, and she knew exactly where it led. Each time Caroline showed up, Sarah vanished a little more into her home, afraid that even her show of sympathy might make her the next target. The pattern was becoming unmistakably clear. Caroline had built her own little empire of fear, and most of our neighbors had learned that silence was safer than resistance. This was no longer about porch lights, mailbox placement, or signs. This was about power, control, a slow, calculated campaign of intimidation designed to wear people down until they stopped asking questions. On day 12 of what I'd come to think of as the siege, Caroline took her campaign of absurdity to new heights. We received a formal citation for our porch light. Apparently, it produced excessive glare, which according to the notice interfered with neighboring residents' night vision and violated dark sky regulations. The fine? $200. Reading the notice, you'd think we had installed stadium floodlights, not a basic fixture left by the previous owners. When Eve asked which neighbor had reported the so-called violation, Caroline's smile practically dripped with satisfaction. Anonymous reports are fully permissible under HOA bylaws, Colonel Reed, she said, emphasizing Eve's title as if it were a joke. Community members deserve the right to report concerns without fear of retaliation or intimidation by violators. That last word landed like a slap. It didn't matter what Eve had done for her country. In Carolyn's world, she was just another name on a list to be disciplined. But something had shifted in Eve. Her posture, her energy, and the tactical officer in her had resurfaced. She was no longer reacting emotionally. She was collecting intel. That night, she laid out her findings like briefing materials, detailed notes, time-stamped photos, timelines. She's following a pattern, Eve told me, voice flat but focused. This isn't enforcement. This is psychological warfare, calculated. Constant pressure meant to destabilize and demoralize. Watching her speak with that quiet certainty, I saw the woman I'd always known resurface, not the shaken veteran questioning her place, but the strategist who once led coordinated missions through war zones. This wasn't about a porch light, it was about dominance. And Eve had become Caroline's chosen adversary. Then, on day 15, it happened. The nuclear option arrived via certified mail. A formal letter from the law firm representing the HOA. The message was blunt: our unpaid fines had reached $525. If we didn't pay immediately and agree to further property oversight, they would place a lien on our home. The phrasing was designed to terrify: foreclosure, legal action, forced compliance. Reading that letter, I watched something break in Eve, but not in the way Carolyn might have hoped. She didn't cry. She didn't sit down. She went to the garage, and then she unleashed. The punching bag in the corner had been mostly untouched since we moved in, but that night, it took a brutal beating. Leather tore, sand spilled. Every blow she landed echoed off the walls like a war drum. I defended this country's freedom for 15 years, she roared between punches. I will not be bullied in my own goddamn neighborhood by a petty tyrant with a clipboard. I stood by the door, stunned by the intensity, by the raw, righteous fury that shook her to her core. Later, I found her sitting on the garage floor, breathless, her head in her hands. She looked a broken bar shattered, like something inside her had cracked under the pressure. Maybe she's right, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe military people really don't understand how the civilian world works. My heart broke as I knelt beside her, not just because she was hurting, but because I could see how deep the damage went, how close she was to believing that she was the problem, not the system stacked against her. But in that moment, I made a quiet vow: we were going to fight back, no matter what it took. The next morning, the battle shifted. Sarah appeared at our front door, pale and trembling, a thick manila folder clutched in her hands. She looked terrified, like someone risking everything just by standing there. But in her eyes was something else. Resolve. Colonel Reed, she whispered, barely louder than a breath. There's something you need to know. About Carolyn. About what's really been going on. And just like that, everything changed. Sarah stepped inside like a spy defecting from enemy territory. She kept glancing toward the window, Nervous that Caroline might materialize and snatch the words from her mouth, her hand shook as she placed the folder on our kitchen table and carefully spread out its contents: documents, photos, statements, secrets that had been buried for years. Secrets that might finally expose Caroline for who she really was. Sarah laid the folder on our kitchen table with the tense energy of someone who'd rehearsed this moment for months. "I've been documenting everything for 2 years, she began, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier with each word. "Ever since Carolyn destroyed my first neighbor's broken bar, I realized someone had to keep a record of what she was really doing." Inside the folder was a staggering collection of evidence: photographs, citations, police reports, even timelines. It told a story far more disturbing than we had imagined. A methodical campaign of harassment that had been going on for years. We weren't her first victims. We were just next in line. "Carolyn's already destroyed 3 families," Sarah said, flipping through pages with practiced precision. "The Johnsons were a military family, just like yours. He was Army. 2 tours in Afghanistan. They thought they'd found their forever home." She handed us a series of photographs, before and after shots of the Johnsons' house. "In the beginning, it was pristine, full of life and care, but 6 months of relentless citations had reduced it to a shadow of itself: paint peeling, yard overgrown, windows shuttered." "She hit them with violations every day," Sarah said. "Every single day, until they couldn't take it anymore. They sold at a huge loss and disappeared overnight. It was a pattern: identify, isolate, escalate until her target either broke mentally or financially, then spin their departure as a triumph of community standards." Next came the story of Mrs. Wilson, an elderly widow with the most beautiful garden in the neighborhood. Caroline cited her 47 times for supposed botanical infractions, made-up regulations that didn't exist in any HOA bylaws. "She knew the garden was her pride," Sarah explained. "So that's what she destroyed." The details became darker with each page. "The Rodriguez family was the worst case," Sarah said quietly, her voice dropping. "He was Navy, like you, Colonel Reed, a submarine commander with 20 years of service. Caroline drove them out in just 4 months. Her weapon of choice? Their teenage daughter. She accused her of loitering, for waiting at the school bus stop, in front of her own house. From there, Carolyn's tactics escalated. She filed complaints with the school, then CPS, all based on fabricated concerns. Eve flipped through the records in silence: photos, correspondence, time-stamped citations, and I could see her jaw tighten with each revelation. Then Sarah delivered the final blow. "She targets military families on purpose," she said bitterly, "because she says you people think you are above the rules, that you need to be reminded who's really in charge." The venom in Sarah's voice wasn't just anger, it was years of buried outrage finally surfacing. "She told me once that military people get too much respect just for doing their jobs, that civilians like her are the ones who really run the world, that uniforms don't make anyone special." That was the moment Eve fully re-engaged. I watched as the tactical officer in her emerged, calm, methodical, focused. She began organizing Sarah's evidence by date, violation type, escalation point. It was like watching an intelligence operation unfold on our kitchen table. "This isn't community enforcement," Eve said flatly, scanning a timeline. "It's strategic psychological warfare, with a clear targeting methodology." She laid it out. Phase 1, minor citations, cosmetic, barely noticeable. Phase 2, increased frequency, greater severity, letters and fines. Phase 3, legal threats, involving HOA attorneys, lien notices. Phase 4, involving external institutions, the police, schools, government agencies. All of it designed to break resistance, to isolate and demoralize. And then came the part that made my stomach turn: financial records. Sarah had included copies of HOA budgets, expense reports, and reimbursements, all analyzed with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. "I worked in accounting before I retired," she said, tapping the spreadsheets. "These numbers don't add up." According to her analysis, Caroline had been siphoning HOA funds for personal use, including legal expenses related to her harassment campaigns, surveillance equipment, security upgrades installed only on her own property, Her presidency wasn't public service, it was embezzlement, a private empire funded by the very people she was targeting. Eve leaned in, studying the reports with the practiced eye of someone trained to audit logistics under pressure. "She's using home money to finance her vendettas," Eve said grimly, and no one stopped her because they were all too afraid or too isolated to compare notes. Sarah nodded. "That's why I brought it all. I can't fight her alone, but maybe together, we can finally end this." The strategic implications of Sarah's intelligence were undeniable. With a full picture of Caroline's methods and intentions now laid bare, Eve transitioned seamlessly from victim to commander. She began planning our counteroffensive with the same precision she had applied to every operation in her 15 years of military service. "It's time for a direct confrontation," she said, her voice firm with regained authority. This wasn't fear talking, it was command. Eve prepared meticulously. She chose her full navy dress uniform, complete with ribbons, medals, and insignia, not for vanity, but for purpose. Every detail was deliberate, a message crafted to remind anyone watching exactly who she was, and what she represented. The walk to Caroline's house felt more like a military advance than a neighborly visit, Eve's posture radiating discipline, resolve, and the unmistakable weight of institutional power. I followed behind her, phone in hand, ready to record the moment. This wasn't just about us anymore, it was about the future of our life here, and perhaps for others who might follow. When Carolyn answered the door, her initial surprise flickered quickly into something darker, a glint of anticipation, as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. Eve didn't hesitate. "Mrs. Peterson," she said, voice clipped and formal, "I'm Colonel Evelyn Reed, United States Navy. This systematic harassment of my family ends now." She presented her military ID with all the gravitas of an official proceeding, not as a neighbor asking for peace, but as a representative of an institution Carolyn had gone out of her way to insult. Her tone brooked no debate. This was a cease and desist, wrapped in rank and reinforced by the full weight of her service. But instead of retreating, Carolyn smiled, a slow, calculated expression that sent a chill down my spine. "A full colonel," she said, with theatrical admiration. "How impressive." Then came the first strike. "You know," she continued, her voice casual, "I've done a lot of reading about what deployment stress can do to officers. Anger issues, adjustment problems, paranoia, difficulty submitting to civilian authority. Sound familiar?" Her words weren't random insults. They were tactical, sharpened to pierce Eve's most vulnerable spots. "The military takes reports from concerned civilians very seriously," Carolyn said softly. "One detailed phone call can trigger a full investigation into your mental fitness and leadership capacity. It's about community safety, after all." The implication landed like a bomb. If we pressed forward, she'd retaliate by trying to destroy Eve's career, not just socially, but institutionally. She'd studied the system. She knew how to weaponize it. In that moment, the scope of the threat shifted completely. Caroline wasn't a petty tyrant. She was a predator, a highly intelligent manipulator who'd researched the exact pressure points to destabilize and discredit military professionals, and she was ready, eager to use them. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what I'm capable of, Colonel," she said. "But you're about to find out." Was she bluffing, or did she have a real plan? Type A bluff or a plan below. We got our answer the next morning. Carolyn's psychological warfare campaign began with chilling precision. Like a well-planned military op, she moved to destabilize morale and perception. She started subtly, initiating a whisper campaign among the neighbors. Casual chats during morning walks. Quiet concerns voiced at mailboxes and dog parks. The narrative she spun was almost benevolent. That poor military woman, a broken bar, she hasn't been quite right since coming back. So tense lately. So broken bar, unpredictable. Her manipulation was masterful. She didn't accuse, she expressed concern. She didn't confront, she planted doubt. Within 2 days, people who once smiled and waved at Eve now looked uncertain, even wary, as though they couldn't tell if they were showing kindness or ignoring a potential threat. By midweek, she escalated again, at this time involving law enforcement. She began placing calls to the police non-emergency line, her tone practiced, her wording carefully chosen to sound calm, concerned, and utterly reasonable. "I just wanted to report something I've noticed," she said. "My neighbor, a military officer, she's been acting a broken bar off lately. Loud, aggressive. I think she's threatening people, and I'm genuinely concerned for the safety of the community." Each report was calculated, not overtly malicious, just enough to cast suspicion, enough to start a paper trail, enough to ensure that, if things did escalate, Eve's record would already be stained by Carolyn's fiction. It wasn't just defamation, it was character assassination disguised as civic responsibility. Caroline had set the battlefield. Now she was executing her campaign with terrifying precision, and Eve was the target. Carolyn understood the system, and she knew how to weaponize it. She was well aware that police departments took any report involving military personnel seriously, especially when mental health was mentioned, and she was exploiting that fact ruthlessly, building a case against Eve that could irreparably damage her career, even without a single criminal charge. Her strategy revealed its full sophistication when she escalated to staged confrontations, designed to provoke reactions she could frame as threats. During Eve's morning jogs, Carolyn would appear at precisely the right moment, clipboard in hand and home materials visible, at the perfect image of a concerned civic leader just doing her duty. "Still running away from your problems, Colonel?" she'd call out with feigned concern. "Or are you running toward them today?" Each comment was a calculated strike, not to cause immediate damage, but to erode Eve's composure over time. The goal was simple: trigger a reaction, then document it, and Caroline had made sure her house was rigged with security cameras capturing multiple angles, carefully chosen to make Eve appear aggressive and herself, the frail, older woman just trying to keep the peace. Then came the morning when it all escalated. Carolyn timed her ambush perfectly, waiting until Eve was mid-workout, flushed, focused, and naturally intense. As Eve passed her driveway, Caroline delivered another subtle provocation cloaked in neighborly concern. "What exactly are you implying, Mrs. Peterson?" Eve asked, finally halting, her patience worn thin after days of thinly veiled jabs. Carolyn's reply was smooth, rehearsed, and razor-sharp. "Nothing at all, Colonel Reed," she said, eyes glinting. "I'm simply expressing concern about your ongoing broken bar civilian readjustment difficulties, and the impact they might be having on our peaceful neighborhood." Their exchange, of course, was captured in full from carefully chosen angles that would later be edited to serve whatever narrative Carolyn wished. And the footage was only one piece of the trap. What made her plan so insidious wasn't just the manipulation of imagery, it was her deep understanding of cultural perception. She knew there were civilians who didn't see military service with admiration, but with unease. She exploited those undercurrents, twisting community respect for veterans into wary suspicion. Carolyn's whisper campaign had never been idle gossip. It was a strategic weapon, crafted to turn legitimate concern for veterans' well-being into paranoia and fear. And then, just as planned, the trap sprung. Within an hour of that exchange, 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of our house. Dispatch records would later show that multiple calls had been made reporting a domestic disturbance involving an unstable military officer. Sergeant Marcus Cole and Officer Martinez emerged from their vehicle with the steady professionalism of law enforcement trained to handle volatile situations, especially those involving potentially dangerous individuals with military training. They found Eve in our garage, still dripping with sweat, pounding away at the heavy bag with the focused fury of someone exorcising emotional stress through discipline. But to an outsider, especially one primed with Carolyn's narrative, the image was damning. An agitated veteran, physically exerting herself in an aggressive manner, alone, in a garage. It was exactly the scene Caroline had constructed in her mind, now made real, and she didn't waste the opportunity. "Officers," she began, her voice trembling just enough to seem authentic, "I'm genuinely frightened, for myself and for our entire community." Her performance was award-worthy. She was the picture of concerned restraint, struggling to maintain composure as she described Eve's increasingly erratic behavior. "She's been making verbal threats, stalking my property, and acting in ways that suggest serious psychological instability. I think she needs professional intervention, for everyone's safety, including her own." She backed her claims with a portfolio of so-called evidence, photographs, audio clips, and polished incident reports that looked legitimate on the surface. To the officers, it likely seemed as though they were dealing with a genuine case of community concern and not a calculated campaign of character assassination. Sergeant Cole approached Eve with cautious professionalism, his hand subtly near his radio, eyes scanning for potential escalation. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "we've received multiple reports of aggressive and threatening behavior toward your neighbors. We need to speak with you to determine what's really happening here." In that moment, it became clear Carolyn had achieved exactly what she set out to do. The police weren't approaching Eve as a decorated officer. They weren't treating her like someone who had served with honor, who had earned every ribbon on her uniform. They were treating her like a threat, a danger, a problem that needed to be neutralized. From across the lawn, Carolyn watched the scene unfold, eyes cold and calculating, posture relaxed, satisfaction radiating from her like heat off asphalt. To her, this was victory, the culmination of a campaign months, maybe years in the making. And it wasn't over yet. Eve's response shifted the entire dynamic in a way Caroline had neither expected nor prepared for. Rather than react defensively or emotionally, Eve stopped her workout immediately and snapped into a posture of perfect military attention. The air around her seemed to change as she radiated discipline, control, and authority. "Sergeant," she said, her voice steady and commanding, "I'm Colonel Evelyn Reed, United States Navy, USS Harry S. Truman, active duty." The clarity and power of her words left no room for doubt. "I request that you verify my credentials and service record before making any assumptions about my conduct or psychological fitness." The transformation was striking. Just moments earlier, Eve could have been mistaken for an agitated civilian. Now, she was unmistakably a senior military officer, calm, composed, and in command. The effect on Sergeant Marcus Cole was immediate. His eyes widened slightly in recognition, and his posture shifted from cautious engagement to formal respect. "Colonel, ma'am," he replied, instinctively straightening, "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Then he added, "Sergeant Marcus Cole, Army, 82nd Airborne, retired, 20 years, honorably." The shift in tone was unmistakable. Eve wasn't being treated as a threat anymore, she was being addressed as a superior. Across the street, Carolyn's confident smirk began to falter. Marcus cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion with full consideration of your record and standing, ma'am." As he reviewed Eve's bearing with the eye of someone who understood military structure, Carolyn made one last desperate play to regain control. Her smirk returned, strained but present. "Ask her about the incident report, Sergeant," she said, her voice edged with triumph. "Ask her why she really came home early from deployment. Was she bluffing, or had she uncovered something real?" At that moment, I realized we'd reached the turning point. Either Carolyn would bury us, or we'd dismantle her narrative completely. Fortunately, I'd been preparing for this exact moment since our first encounter. Like Eve, I approached threats with precision, and I'd been documenting everything. "Sergeant Cole," I said, stepping forward and unlocking my tablet, "you'll want to review this." On the screen was a meticulously organized digital archive, audio recordings of Carolyn threatening Eve's career, detailed logs of her behavior, and a timeline that left no doubt about the pattern of targeted harassment. Included were 2 years of Sarah's documentation, complete with timestamps, geolocation data, and even home meeting transcripts showing Carolyn's manipulations in action. But that wasn't all. We had signed statements from 4 from Liesa, each describing how Caroline had subjected them to the same pattern of escalating pressure, minor HOA infractions followed by personal attacks, intimidation, and finally, legal threats or surveillance. The intent was always the same: force them out or force them silent. Sarah's financial audit had uncovered irregularities to HOA funds diverted for private legal expenses, surveillance equipment purchased without authorization, and suspicious payments to a private investigator Carolyn had hired. Sergeant Cole studied the evidence with a seriousness that spoke volumes. His expression darkened with each new page. "This is a broken bar, extremely thorough," he said finally. "And it presents a very different picture than what we've been hearing." Carolyn's mask began to slip. For the first time, She looked genuinely cornered. She lashed out with the one weapon she had left: emotional manipulation. "They're fabricating all of this," she snapped, her voice rising into dramatic outrage. "This is the obsessive, unstable behavior I've been reporting. Keeping detailed records like these. Who does that, unless they're paranoid and mentally unwell?" She turned to the officers, eyes wide with calculated fear. "You're looking at a textbook case of PTSD. A delusional military officer, enabled by a husband who's just as unhinged. They've been stalking me, surveilling me, trying to destroy a widow who's simply trying to protect our community." But her act had gone too far. The desperation in her voice undercut the performance. She wasn't a frightened neighbor anymore. She was a manipulator unraveling in real time. The contrast between her emotional outburst and Eve's unwavering discipline couldn't have been clearer. And for the first time, Caroline realized she had miscalculated badly. The weight of evidence we presented was too substantial and too professionally documented for any experienced law enforcement officer to dismiss. Sergeant Marcus Cole had seen his share of false accusations and manufactured crises over 2 decades of military and civilian service. He knew the difference between a genuine victim and a practiced manipulator. Eve's calm professionalism stood in stark contrast to Carolyn's unraveling performance. While Eve maintained the bearing of a senior officer under pressure, Carolyn grew increasingly erratic, her composure cracking under scrutiny. The most damning pieces of evidence were the audio recordings: a clear, unedited, and unmistakably her voice, threats, coercion, and most importantly, knowledge and intent that completely contradicted her claims of being an innocent neighbor harassed by an unstable veteran. The recordings revealed her not just as a participant but as the architect of the conflict. Then Eve made her final movie of the kind of decisive action that had defined her as a leader throughout her military career. She didn't argue, she didn't explain, she simply made a call. "Military police, this is Colonel Evelyn Reed," she said with crisp authority. "I'm reporting sustained civilian harassment that is now interfering with my ability to perform my duties. I am requesting formal guidance." This wasn't a plea for special treatment, it was a declaration of accountability. By involving military authorities, Eve demonstrated her confidence in her own conduct and raised the stakes for anyone attempting to sabotage her reputation with baseless claims. Marcus's posture shifted the moment she hung up the phone. He stepped forward with renewed clarity and purpose. "Mrs. Peterson," he said evenly, "filing multiple false reports with law enforcement is a serious criminal offense. It carries penalties including possible jail time." His tone hardened as he added, "Harassing active-duty military personnel is treated with the utmost seriousness across all levels of law enforcement, and the documentation we've reviewed strongly suggests you've been running an organized campaign of intimidation and character defamation." The evidence laid it all bare. Carolyn wasn't just a bitter neighbor. She had waged a methodical, multi-year effort to drive military families out of the community through psychological warfare and fabricated complaints. And suddenly, the illusion of her authority began to collapse. Word of the police investigation and the evidence we presented spread quickly through the neighborhood. That same evening, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting. The result was unanimous. Caroline was removed from her position as president, and a full audit of the HOA's financial records was launched. Almost immediately, people who had been too afraid to speak up for years began to come forward. Mrs. Patterson, from across the street, revealed she'd been threatened with fines simply for showing support for military families. An elderly neighbor admitted he had avoided publicly welcoming Eve home, fearing retaliation from Carolyn. The shift in community atmosphere was incredible to witness. Fear gave way to honesty. Silence gave way to solidarity. At that same emergency meeting, Sarah was elected interim HOA president by unanimous vote. Her first act in office, issuing a full suspension and review of every violation and fine levied under Carolyn's leadership. The community was finally reclaiming its voice. The financial audit uncovered what we already suspected: thousands of dollars in misused funds. Caroline had been using home money to finance private investigators, pay legal fees for personal disputes, and purchase surveillance equipment, none of it for the community's benefit. All of it for personal vendettas. Sergeant Cole assured Eve that the criminal investigation would be pursued thoroughly and that charges for false reporting were likely once the district attorney reviewed the case. As the last police car left and the neighbors slowly approached USA, not with suspicion, but with support, apologies, and gratitude, I saw Eve reclaim something far more important than her standing in the community. I saw her return to herself. The doubt and isolation she'd felt since transitioning back to civilian life were gone. In their place stood the woman I had married 15 years earlier, composed, courageous, and unshakably principled. She no longer questioned where she belonged, because what she now understood, what we both understood, was that defending freedom didn't stop at deployment. Sometimes, it meant standing your ground in your own neighborhood, against those who weaponized power to silence others. Before leaving, Sergeant Cole approached us one last time. He stood tall, saluted sharply, and addressed Eve with the respect due to her rank and her resolve. "Colonel," he said firmly, "you have my word that there will be no further trouble in this neighborhood." "That's a guarantee, backed by the full weight of this department." And this time, everyone was listening. "As an officer of this department, that's a guarantee," Marcus said firmly, as we watched Caroline being escorted toward a waiting police car for formal questioning. Her expression was chilling and not remorseful, not ashamed, just calculating. Her eyes lingered on our house, not with regret, but with cold analysis, already considering her next move. Marcus noticed it too. He rested a hand on his cuffs and stepped closer, locking eyes with her. "Ma'am," he said evenly, his voice laced with years of hard-won authority, "you need to decide right now whether you want to make this easier or harder for everyone involved." Would she confess, or would she make one final, desperate attempt to twist the truth? 3 weeks later, it was clear the battle was over and the community was finally healing. Our neighborhood had transformed into what we'd always hoped it could be when Eve first returned home from deployment. Under Sarah's leadership as the new HOA president, the focus shifted from control and intimidation to true community building. Welcome committees were formed for incoming military families. HOA policies were rewritten to promote fairness, respect, and actual improvement of property values without micromanaging people's lives. Carolyn's violations and fines were not only overturned but followed by formal apologies from the HOA board. The board also issued a public commitment to transparency and community oversight, ensuring no future abuses of power could take root unnoticed. Families who had been driven out under Carolyn's reign were contacted directly, offered apologies, guarantees of protection, and invitations to return. Many did. Others, even if they chose not to return, expressed gratitude that someone had finally stood up to the toxic system. The shift in atmosphere was undeniable. Neighbors once fearful of retaliation now greeted one another openly. Front yards that had been watched with suspicion were now shared spaces for kids to play and adults to connect. The days of silent intimidation were over. Meanwhile, the criminal investigation into Carolyn's conduct had gained momentum. The evidence we submitted, combined with additional witness statements and financial records, led to multiple felony charges: filing false police reports, financial fraud related to HOA fund misuse, and organized harassment of military families, who are a protected class under several state and federal statutes. Prosecutors called it one of the most thoroughly documented HOA-related abuse cases they had ever handled. Caroline's repeated claims of being the real victim fell apart completely. Audio recordings exposed her threats in her own words. Financial documents traced association funds directly to her personal vendettas. Testimonies from former board members and neighbors confirmed years of deliberate cruelty. Faced with overwhelming evidence, she accepted a plea deal. The terms were substantial: full restitution to every family affected, mandatory community service at veteran support organizations, and a lifetime ban from holding any HOA or community leadership position. Eve's role in resisting the abuse became a source of inspiration. Neighbors, veterans groups, and community members alike rallied around her. A proper welcome home celebration was finally held, a months overdue, but filled with genuine appreciation and pride. Veteran support organizations reached out personally to thank her not just for her military service, but for standing her ground against a growing issue affecting many service members, HOA harassment. Media outlets picked up the story, highlighting it as a case study in how to fight back against petty tyrants who wield local authority like a weapon. Marcus became a regular visitor to the neighborhood, not as a watchdog, but as a supporter. He checked in often, helping ensure the progress we'd made didn't fade with time. His presence offered reassurance. The system was now watching the right people. Other military families from surrounding areas began sharing their own stories as similar patterns of being targeted, isolated, or punished simply for existing within rigid HOA structures. What had once felt like isolated incidents now took shape as a broader pattern. But Eve's example showed that it could be fought and won. A quiet, powerful network formed, active duty personnel, veterans, and civilian allies committed to protecting military families from this kind of abuse. The fight for justice had sparked something larger, a movement grounded in the same values Eve had carried into every deployment: courage, service, and duty to others. Standing in our backyard beneath a golden sunset, with the sounds of laughter and life returning to our neighborhood, Eve reflected on what had changed, and not just in the community, but in herself. "You know what I missed most while I was deployed?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the American flag gently waving in our yard. "It wasn't the big moments, not the medals or the ceremonies. It was this, just knowing that good people could live in peace, without fear of being targeted by someone clinging to a scrap of power." That simple truth struck me deeply. Freedom didn't just need defending overseas, it needed defending right here, where unchecked authority could quietly erode it from within. This experience had taught us both something essential. Defending liberty isn't a singular act of heroism, it's a continuous effort, one that must be upheld wherever bullies in positions of power try to silence or control others through fear. And finally, the last chapter of our fight was about to be written. A broken bar. Not long after the investigation wrapped, we learned that Caroline had quietly sold her house and relocated to another state, one where her reputation hadn't yet caught up with her. There was no dramatic farewell, no accountability speech, just a quiet exit under pressure, leaving behind the mess she'd created and the community she'd failed to break. Ironically, the new owners of her former home turned out to be a military couple. The husband, an Air Force major, shared that he'd specifically chosen this neighborhood after hearing about how it had rallied around its service members. Watching him step out of the moving truck in uniform, I was struck by just how far we'd come. Eve's courage hadn't just protected our family, it had changed the trajectory of our community. Her stand against injustice had created a space where military families were welcomed, respected, and protected. This neighborhood was no longer defined by fear, fines, or control. It was a place where service to others was honored, where rules served the community instead of weaponizing it, and where people stood together to reject the misuse of authority. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting long shadows across a quiet, peaceful street, Eve glanced toward the house that had once symbolized Carolyn's grip on the neighborhood. Now, it was becoming a true home, one grounded in purpose, not power. "Turns out," she said with a small smile, "some ranks are recognized everywhere." Then she added, with the calm authority of someone who had earned every ounce of respect she carried, "but real respect, that's earned by standing up for what's right, and no matter what title you hold or what uniform you wear." That lesson echoed across every porch, every family, every neighbor who had found the courage to speak out. This wasn't just about military service, it was about building a community where no one could hide behind a clipboard or badge to abuse others, and where good people stood together instead of shrinking back. As our new neighbors began settling in, hanging curtains, unloading boxes, waving to the kids next door, I found myself thinking of all the others out there facing similar battles. Maybe they were struggling with an oppressive hoe, a toxic board, or someone drunk on authority and unchecked power. Maybe they felt alone. If this story proves anything, it's that you're not. And maybe, just maybe, our fight can be a reminder that standing up doesn't just protect you, it changes everything. It builds better neighborhoods, stronger communities, and safer places for those who protect all of us. Have your own horror story? You're not alone. Share it below. We believe you. And if the story inspired you to take a stand, Hit the bell and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life stories, because sometimes, real people are wilder than fiction.